E inoi tātou. E te atua kāroa, e tuwhera ana ngā ngākau katoa ki a koe, e mohiote ana ngā hiahia katoa, e kore hoki e ngaro i a koe te mea huna. Whakahangia iho tō wairua tapu, hei whakamā i ngā whakaro o mātou ngākau, kia tino aroha i mātou ki a koe, kia tika ai te whakanui i tō ingoa tapu, ko ihu karaiti hoki tō mātou ariki. Āmine. A reading from 2 Samuel chapter 23 and beginning at verse 1. These are the last words of David. David, the son of Jesse, speaks. David, the man who was raised up so high. David, the man anointed by God, by the God of Jacob. David, the sweet psalmist of Israel. The Spirit of the Lord speaks through me. His words are upon my tongue. The God of Israel spoke. The Rock of Israel said to me. The one who rules righteously, who rules in the fear of God, is like the light of morning at sunrise, like a morning without clouds, like the gleaming of the sun on new grass after rain. Is it not my family God has chosen? Yes, he has made an everlasting covenant with me. His agreement is arranged and guaranteed in every detail. He will ensure my safety and success. But the godless are like thorns to be thrown away, for they tear the hand that touches them. One must use iron tools to chop them down. They will be totally consumed by fire. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. Thanks be to God. Well, this morning, as we come to David's last sort of public words, this isn't, I guess, a deathbed thing. This is his public pronouncement, looking back on his life and giving his perspective on how things have gone. We recognise that people's final words, certainly the words they intend to be their final words, carry the weight of knowing that their ability to influence the course of events, the course of their own life, the course of human history is coming to an end. They also matter because people tend to be truthful as they come to these words. And David here, knowing the story as we do of what's gone before and all David's failures as well as his successes, we might perhaps think that he was glossing over some of the more difficult bits. This is like a funeral eulogy, perhaps, where the unfortunate things in somebody's life are left to one side and only the good things are spoken of. But I wonder if you noticed here that the way David speaks is as a forgiven person. He's very aware of his failures because instead of talking about God's promise so much to him personally, he speaks of God's promise to his family. The word that's used is of his house, so a recognition of the enduring nature of the promise to his descendants, even though in his own lifetime that promise has been damaged by David's actions. I wonder if you notice too that his references are to what God has done through him and not to his own abilities. These are the words of a forgiven person who understands that whatever has happened that's good comes by grace. He speaks of the Holy Spirit's work in inspiring him to speak. The Spirit of the Lord speaks through me, his words are upon my tongue, David says. And he speaks not of his own strength and military power, even though in his lifetime other people sung of those things. And instead he says, it is the Rock of Israel who's spoken to me, a reference to God's strength that he has found. He also is able to speak the language of somebody who's found God's forgiveness and who understands the difference between somebody who, despite their failures, is somebody who's walking towards God, and the difference between that and somebody who's walking away from God. And so even though David has failed, like all of us, this doesn't mean that David then is unable to speak of the difference between good and evil. He finishes by talking about the difference between the person who rules rightly, who brings light into the world, like the light of morning at sunrise. And he also speaks of the fate of those who set themselves up against God. For all David's faults, he's never turned to complete apostasy. That's the turning away from God. That means that his whole way of life, his whole course of action turned away in a permanent way. And we do encounter people like that. We encounter those who know of God's goodness, but who have chosen to walk in permanent, long-standing disobedience to God's commandments. They say perhaps God didn't mean that in his scriptures. Perhaps it was only for a particular time. Or, as I've had people come to me, I know what God says in the scriptures, but I feel like he's saying something different to me. And David is able at the end of his life, speaking as a forgiven person who knows the grace of God, to say there is still a difference between being forgiven and knowing my fault and pretending that I don't have a fault at all. There's a difference between acknowledging that God has been good to me in a way that I don't deserve, and somebody who says, I deserve, despite my way of life which I approve of, I deserve God's seal of approval on my way of life too. In fact, where we encounter this particularly is when people want the approval of the church for a way of life that is not compatible with God's standards. The church welcomes all, but does not affirm everybody in their way of life. In fact, the church's role is, at least in part, to point people towards the rule of the good King Jesus, who tells us the difference between what is right and wrong. In fact, holds us to a standard far higher than the one that David is talking about holding people to. Jesus picks up this language himself as the descendant of David, the one who fulfills the promise that God was making to David's house and descendants. And Jesus picks up this last poem of David's in the parable of the wheat and the weeds, which you can find in Matthew chapter 13, verse 36. Picks up a lot of the words and the imagery that's used and tells the story of those who are very puzzled by the fact that those who are evil, who set themselves against God, seem to be found even in the household of God, even in the church itself. And Jesus says that the wheat and the weeds need to be left to grow up together. And I think really he's talking particularly about the world more than the church, given the church's calling here. And at the end of the world, Jesus says, that's when the imagery that David's talking about those who are evil being chopped down with an iron tool, that's when this will happen, Jesus says too. So the church's role is not so much to try and chop the weeds out of the world. Instead, it's to be the place of light where we are ruled by a good king, where the light of the morning sun is visible in the holiness of the church, the way we live a life that's very different from the world around us. And we endure patiently the presence of evil, knowing that our good king, who does rule justly, but who is also merciful, is giving time, and that in the end evil will be ended, and sadly those who set themselves against God will find themselves facing the punishment that Jesus speaks of in that parable in Matthew chapter 13. David, of course, speaks back in 2 Samuel of the way in which his rule is one that involves God lifting him up. And this is another image that's picked up in the New Testament. And the image of being lifted up by God is applied to the cross. And so we see David being lifted up to a place of power and strength. But in Jesus we see this fulfilled as Jesus is lifted up on the cross in order to save. One day we will see him lifted up in that sense of being exalted in order to rule finally. But in this present age of the world, as we wait and we see the wheat and the weeds growing together in the world, we look to Jesus who's lifted up and who is glorified on the cross particularly. And this is a time of mercy and of salvation. So if we know how the story is going to end, how the victory of Jesus Christ, David's descendant, the true inheritor of David's throne, we know how that's going to end for those who oppose God. Therefore, we ought to feel very much the burden of the reading that we had on Sunday, for example, from Ezekiel, to be the watchman who warn people away from evil while there is still time before Jesus returns to judge. During this time, we also ought to win people over to the good news, to the mercy that's offered, and say, one day you will look up and you will see Jesus exalted as the King who comes to judge the living and the dead, as we say each Sunday in the Creed. But for now, let's look up to the one who is raised up and exalted in the image of the cross as a sign that God wishes to pour out his mercy in this age of the world. And let's help people to find that mercy while there is still time. I runga I te ingoa o te matua te tama me te wairua tapu. Āmenia. Ko ākona nei tātou e tō tātou ariki, ka inoi tātou. E tō mātou matua I te rangi, kia tapu tō ingoa, kia tai mai tō rangatiratanga. Kia mea tia tāu e pai ai ki runga ki te whenua, kia rita anō ki tō te rangi. Hō mai kia mātou ai nei he taro ma mātou mō tēnei rā, muroa o mātou hara. Me mātou hoki e muru nei, I o te hunga e harana kia mātou. Au hoki mātou e kawea kia whakawaia, engari whakaorangia mātou I te kino. Nau hoki te rangatiratanga, te kaha me te karoria. Ake, ake ake, āmene. And we say together the grace, kia tau kia tātou katoa, te atawhai o tō tātou ariki o ihu karaiti, me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga ki te wairua tapu, ake, ake ake, āmene. Kia ora tātou.